What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're gonna be working on this bike right here, my 2015 Ducati Panigale 899. And more specifically, we're gonna be doing a fork seal replacement because the right side fork leg leaks and has leaked ever since I bought the bike. The leak has gotten worse every time I ride it, and the fork seal cleaning tools that I've tried have only temporarily fixed the problem. So today we are gonna fix that, and we're gonna see how difficult it is to do it ourselves. So let's get into it and see how bad this actually is. So the first step is gonna be to get that front wheel off the bike. I used a head lift stand to get all the weight off of the fork, pulled the wheel off, loosened both of the brake calipers, and then slid each of the fork legs out one by one after loosening the top and bottom triple tree bolts. Now that I had each of the fork legs out, popped one of them into the vise, and then I used my Ducati certified channel locks to loosen up the top nut. This is the top of the fork that you would see up by your dash on the bike when it's installed. This top nut wasn't all that tight, but it is some fine threads that you want to be careful not to damage. After it's loosened up, you won't be able to pull this internal piece out, but you will be able to drain some of the oil off before moving on. Next up is to use this special Ducati fork tool. I ordered it off of eBay. I'll put a link in the description. Without this tool, you would have no chance of getting this internal piece loosened up. After I dropped that tool in the top of the fork, I mounted up the bottom of the fork into the vise so that I get some leverage on this tool here, and loosened it. Careful not to bend anything as I was doing it. This again wasn't all that tight, but it does have some spring-loaded pressure behind it, so be ready for that when that last thread comes loose. Funny enough, with this tool, it was made out of aluminum, so every time I used it, it got tighter and tighter onto the fork leg. After that internal piece is loosened, you can pull the whole thing out. This is where most of the oil is going to be contained. And you've also got a spring and a top and a bottom plastic piece, as you see fall out of my drain pan. After draining all that fluid out of there and cleaning up everything as good as I could for the moment, it's time to start trying to separate the upper and lower bit of this fork body. I'm going to use a small flathead screwdriver to carefully pop this old dust cover off. Be careful not to scratch any of the fork as you do that. Next, using that same little flathead screwdriver, I'm going to remove the spring-loaded clip that sits inside the fork leg right there. To separate the upper and lower of this fork, you're going to have to use a little bit of brute force to pop that existing seal out of the fork body, just like that. Now you'll see here, you can actually see a little bit of debris and shavings that was on mine. That's because I suspect this is the first time this fork has ever been serviced. Using that flathead screwdriver, I just separated the edges of this spring-loaded clamp. And as I did that, you can slide it off the lower and put it to the side carefully. You'll need it again. Once that spring-loaded clip is off, you can slide that little bushing, washer, and existing fork seal off. This is a good time to check and make sure the orientation of everything and take pictures for the reassembly. Now let's get everything cleaned up before we reassemble. Now getting everything as clean as I did is probably not entirely necessary for this, but seeing as how this is most likely the first fork service that this bike has ever had, and I had everything apart, it just made sense to clean everything to its fullest before reassembling. With everything cleaned up, it's time to start the reassembly process. The first seal to go on is the dust seal. I'm going to carefully slide it over these grooves, and I'm using this flat-headed pick to help guide the seal carefully over those ridges until I can slide it all the way down the fork. Next up is the actual fork seal itself. This is the seal that's going to be holding back all the oil, so you want to make sure you don't damage this as you're sliding it down here. Again, careful with sliding it over those ridges. Next, you'll see I'm referencing the picture that I took when I disassembled this fork. Always important to take pictures as you disassemble. So next up was that washer, followed by the bushing, and finally the spring-loaded clip. The spring-loaded clip is going to snap in to the groove as you push it over it. You'll know when it goes in because it makes a very positive snap. For the next step, I'm using some of the fork oil to actually lubricate the inside of that fork body for this next step, which I'll be sliding the new bushing and seal into the upper body. So pushing this new fork seal in can be a bit of a challenge. I actually opted to 3D print a little bit of a kind of a pushing tool that I used to slip into the fork and help push evenly that seal into place. You can get a fork seal tool, which is what I would recommend. They're not very expensive, but I didn't have one at the time of doing this, so I just made one myself. And I ended up using the bottom of the fork itself kind of as a slide hammer against that 3D printed tool to help push that seal into place as needed. kind of hard to see when the seal is in place where it needs to be, but when it is, you're gonna see a groove on the inside where this clip here is gonna snap into place. You will not be able to snap this in if you don't push the bushing in far enough. Using a little flathead screwdriver, I just guide that spring-loaded clip into place and it snaps in very easily. Check all the way around the clip to make sure all pieces of it are in, and then you can slide the dust cover back down and push it into place as well. Next up, we can work on the top side of the fork by dropping in this first plastic piece, followed by the spring itself that's going to sit on top of that, and lastly is going to be the black plastic piece that sits on top of the spring. Time to fill it up with some oil. The Ducati 899 Panigale takes 563 milliliters of fork oil per fork leg. So measure it out carefully and pour it in slowly so it has a little bit of time to settle down through the chambers. Now we can start placing the cartridge back inside the fork body. You can see I'm going pretty slow with it here. That's because if I was to lower this all the way in, I would have flooded the oil over top of the fork. You have to go slow enough to let it fill into the chambers of the fork body and that cartridge and get rid of any air bubbles as you're lowering it down. You'll see here I've already got the fork tool there in place and ready to go, because the next step here is going to be screwing the top piece, that cartridge, into the fork itself. I spilled some oil here because it is pretty tough to keep pressure on this fork tool and spin it at the same time. It took a little bit of work to get those threads to catch, but if you keep good pressure on it, keep the bottom of the fork from pushing out. That's what I'm doing with my left hand there, holding the bottom of that fork and pushing down on the fork tool with my right hand as I rotate it. The final step in this reassembly process is to retighten that top cap. It's fine threads again, so definitely hand tighten them before you snug it up with the tool of your choice. You will see as I started to tighten this down that the upper fork body rotates. I actually had to reposition this down into the vise to hold the fork body as I tightened it. And there you have it. So we are now complete with the reassembly and the rebuild of these fork legs. You can see we've got them fully assembled. We've got new seals in both of them and fresh fork oil in each of them. So I took the opportunity last night as I finished these to wipe them down really good with a degreaser and then rubbing alcohol to make sure that I wasn't putting these parts back onto the bike with any oil residue or gunk still on them. So I took advantage of the opportunity to clean them up real good. Second part to that was that I wanted to be extra sure that the fork legs were nice and clean of oil, so if they start to leak after my test ride, I'll know right away that my seals are still an issue and I'm gonna need to fix them again. Hopefully that's not the case. So with that, we are ready to reinstall these fork legs onto the bike. I did realize that I didn't do a very good job of documenting the removal process of these from the Panigale. There are a couple of little nuances, one of which that I really wish I knew before I got too far into it, but I'll point that out and try to provide a little bit more detail as I get going into the reinstall of these forks onto the bike. So with that, let's put them back on. I'm gonna install the left fork leg first. I know this one is the left fork leg because it has the ABS sensor bracket right here. You can see it's got these looks like little thin shims, but that is where that ABS sensor goes into, and on this bike it's on the left. So I'm gonna start with that one. Just like that. Keep on coming up through the top clamp. And it's a pretty tight fit. I'm gonna leave that there. Not worried about it falling out. One thing you'll want to keep in mind, align the bottom of your fork so that the brake caliper bracket is oriented correctly. You can spin this still, but at least in my case, my head lift stand is real close to where the fork is, so it won't let me rotate it around. And since I can't rotate it around, I wouldn't be able to get the wheel on, and if I can't get the wheel on, I can't get the stand off. So keep that in mind. Just align it right from the beginning, and it'll save you a lot of headache at the end of this process. Now on to the right side. Let's see. Get the orientation set up. Carefully slide it up through the bottom triple tree. Get that right side clip on to slip around it. And then keep it going on up to the top clamp. And we'll leave it right there. So now that we have both those in there, I think we are good to go. I'm gonna start off by just snugging these down. Want to make sure that the logos are nice and straight. Got that. I'm actually only going to, for now, snug up the top clamp. Now what I'm aligning them to is the top ring here. There's a little groove around the top of the fork. There's probably 3 or 4 of them. You can use those as reference to set your height of the front end. If you wanted to lower the front end just a little bit, you can do that. But it's going to be very important to make sure that you have both of them at least aligned to the same one. You don't want your fork legs at different lengths. Okay, so that one's snug. We've got our wheel in place. I'm gonna go ahead, try to slip this on through. a little bit of work to get it in there.
So now that we've got the axle on, we can install the axle nut. I'm just going to lightly thread this on and snug it up by hand before we torque it later.
In bolting these calipers on, I'm going to take the opportunity, I guess, while I got the caliper bolts out, I'm going to put these new caliper bolts on. I got these actually as a gift a few months ago, but these are pre-drilled bolts for the calipers. Got holes drilled in the heads so that you can safety wire them real easily. It's not really a requirement for most people, not really a requirement for me either. Just doing track days, it's not usually necessary, but it is a little peace of mind that I like to have. So I'm going to put these on. Well,
putting the new caliper bolts on is pretty straightforward. Just line the caliper up with the rotor and hand thread the new bolts on. I put a little bit of Loctite for good measure. I'm going to snug these bolts down, but I'm not going to torque them until the end, and I'll have the torque spec for you listed at the very end of the video.
Over on the left side of the bike, got the same exact thing to do. Looks like my pads just closed up a little bit there. If they do, no big deal, just separate them so that you've got enough space to fit the rotor on the caliper. A little bit of Loctite again, and hand thread that first few turns in. Second bolt, and perfect. Alright, those are just snugged up. I'm gonna torque them to spec here in just a minute. But next step that I'm going to do is route this ABS sensor around. It goes a little bit like that.
Reinstalling the ABS sensor is really straightforward as well. Just make sure you get those shims back on. Line the bolt through there and then push the sensor through the opening in the bracket from where you removed it from earlier. I will put a little bit of Loctite on this. And then this bolt is not going to be super tight. Really just a hand tight is going to be good enough.
The next step here is going to take a little bit of working at, but we need to route the ABS sensor wire and both of the brake lines through the front mud guard here. You'll see there's a channel in here for those cables and hydraulic lines to fit in there. So I've done this before. It's not my favorite thing to do, but we're gonna get it knocked out here. Going to start by getting this back one on. So there's two two cables. It's the ABS and the left side brake line that has to go in there like that. It does have a little screw. All right, the screw that holds this back clamp piece in is actually a Torx T10. I know that would be hard to tell when you're going through the process of removing all this. There's not a good way to see up in there, but it is a T10 and it will screw in just like that, straight into the plastic. Now is the fun part. All right, so a number 4 Allen key is what you need to put these front mudguard bolts back in. Goes. All right, so now we've got all of them on, I'm gonna snug them down pretty good. They don't need to be super tight. And we're good to go on that one. So, with that, we have got our wheel mounted. And with that, we're done with this project. The final steps that you saw was putting the bodywork all back on. And then of course, you have to drop the front off of the stand to get some load on that front axle. And then torque down your axle nut and the 4 pinch bolts that are on the underside of the fork. Very important that you do that with the wheel on the ground. So overall, my takeaway on this project is that this one was a lot more intimidating to think about doing than it was actually difficult to do. It only required the one specialty tool, which was great. And then everything else was pretty straightforward. It was definitely messy. I caused a huge mess with all the fork oil as I was getting the old oil out, and then of course putting new oil in. But I don't know how else you could do it without making a mess with the oil. Overall, not a very difficult project, and definitely save some money. I think probably I'm about $100 to $130 between the parts and the tool to do this myself versus the over $500 that it would have cost to do at a dealership. And plus we got to do it ourselves. Now I know how to do it. I have the tool to do it. And if I ever have a leaking seal again, I'll be much faster at doing it. So if this video gave you any insight into what it takes to actually change these fork seals, leave a comment below, like the video, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Be doing a lot more work with this bike between upgrades, track days, general maintenance stuff. We'll be doing anything that we can here in the garage, and come along for the ride with me. So thanks for watching.